Part 2 Chapter 1. "Oh grandfather, dear grandfather," cried little Alice, "pray tell us some more stories about your chair." How long a time had fled, since the children had felt any curiosity to hear the sequel of this venerable chair's adventures. Summer was now past and gone, and the better part of autumn likewise. Dreary, chill November was howling, out of doors, and vexing the atmosphere with sudden showers of wintry rain, or sometimes with gusts of snow, that rattled like small pebbles against the windows. When the weather began to grow cool, grandfather's chair had been removed from the summer parlour into a smaller and snugger room. It now stood by the side of a bright blazing wood fire. Grandfather loved a wood fire, far better than a grate of glowing anthracite, or than the dull heat of an invisible furnace, which seems to think that it has done its duty in merely warming the house. But the wood fire is a kindly, cheerful, sociable spirit, sympathizing with mankind, and knowing that to create warmth is but one of the good offices which are expected from it. Therefore it dances on the hearth, and laughs broadly through the room, and plays 1,000 antics, and throws a joyous glow over all the faces that encircle it. In the twilight of the evening, the fire grew brighter and more cheerful. And thus, perhaps, there was something in grandfather's heart, that cheered him most with its warmth and comfort in the gathering twilight of old age. He had been gazing at the red embers, as intently as if his past life were all pictured there, or as if it were a prospect of the future world, when little Alice's voice aroused him. "Dear grandfather," repeated the little girl, more earnestly, "do talk to us again about your chair." Lawrence, and Clara, and Charley, and little Alice, had been attracted to other objects, for 2 or 3 months past. They had sported in the gladsome sunshine of the present, and so had forgotten the shadowy region of the past, in the midst of which stood grandfather's chair. But now, in the autumnal twilight, illuminated by the flickering blaze of the wood fire, they looked at the old chair and thought that it had never before worn such an interesting aspect. There it stood, in the venerable majesty of more than 200 years. The light from the hearth quivered upon the flowers and foliage, that were wrought into its oaken back, and the lion's head at the summit seemed almost to move its jaws and shake its mane. "Does little Alice speak for all of you?" asked grandfather. "Do you wish me to go on with the adventures of the chair?" "Oh, yes, yes, grandfather," cried Clara. "The dear old chair! How strange that we should have forgotten it so long." "Oh, pray begin, grandfather," said Lawrence, "for I think, when we talk about old times, it should be in the early evening before the candles are lighted. The shapes of the famous persons, who once sat in the chair, will be more apt to come back, and be seen among us, in this glimmer and pleasant gloom, than they would in the vulgar daylight. And, besides, we can make pictures of all that you tell us, among the glowing embers and white ashes." Our friend Charley, too, thought the evening the best time to hear grandfather's stories, because he could not then be playing out of doors. So, finding his young auditors unanimous in their petition, the good old gentleman took up the narrative of the historic chair, at the point where he had dropped it. Chapter 2. "You recollect, my dear children," said grandfather, "that we took leave of the chair in 1692, while it was occupied by Sir William Phips. This fortunate treasure-seeker, you will remember, had come over from England, with King William's commission to be governor of Massachusetts. Within the limits of this province were now included the old colony of Plymouth, and the territories of Maine and Nova Scotia. Sir William Phips had likewise brought a new charter from the king, which served instead of a constitution, and set forth the method in which the province was to be governed." "Did the new charter allow the people all their former liberties?" inquired Lawrence. "No," replied grandfather. "Under the first charter, the people had been the source of all power. Winthrop, Endicott, Bradstreet, and the rest of them, had been governors by the choice of the people, without any interference of the king. But henceforth the governor was to hold his station solely by the king's appointment, and during his pleasure, and the same was the case with the lieutenant governor, and some other high officers. The people, however, were still allowed to choose representatives, and the governor's council was chosen by the general court." "Would the inhabitants have elected Sir William Phips," asked Lawrence, "if the choice of governor had been left to them?" "He might probably have been a successful candidate," answered grandfather, "for his adventures and military enterprises had gained him a sort of renown, which always goes a great way with the people. And he had many popular characteristics, being a kind, warm-hearted man, not ashamed of his low origin, nor haughty in his present elevation. Soon after his arrival, he proved that he did not blush to recognize his former associates." "How was that?" inquired Charley. "He made a grand festival at his new brick house," said grandfather, "and invited all the ship-carpenters of Boston to be his guests. At the head of the table, in our great chair, sat Sir William Phips himself, treating these hard-handed men as his brethren, cracking jokes with them, and talking familiarly about old times. I know not whether he wore his embroidered dress, but I rather choose to imagine that he had on a suit of rough clothes, such as he used to labour in, while he was Phips the ship-carpenter. An aristocrat need not be ashamed of the trade, observed Lawrence, for the Tsar Peter the Great once served an apprenticeship to it. Did Sir William Phips make as good a governor as he was a ship-carpenter? Asked Charley. History says but little about his merits as a ship-carpenter, answered grandfather, but, as a governor, a great deal of fault was found with him. Almost as soon as he assumed the government, he became engaged in a very frightful business, which might have perplexed a wiser and better cultivated head than his. This was the witchcraft delusion, and here grandfather gave his auditors such details of this melancholy affair, as he thought it fit for them to know. They shuddered to hear that a frenzy, which led to the death of many innocent persons, had originated in the wicked arts of a few children. They belonged to the Reverend Mr. Paris, minister of Salem. These children complained of being pinched, and pricked with pins, and otherwise tormented by the shapes of men and women, who were supposed to have power to haunt them invisibly, both in darkness and daylight. Often, in the midst of their family and friends, the children would pretend to be seized with strange convulsions, and would cry out that the witches were afflicting them. These stories spread abroad, and caused great tumult and alarm. From the foundation of New England, it had been the custom of the inhabitants, in all matters of doubt and difficulty, to look to their ministers for counsel. So they did now, but, unfortunately, the ministers and wise men were more deluded than the illiterate people. Cotton Mather, a very learned and eminent clergyman, believed that the whole country was full of witches and wizards, who had given up their hopes of heaven, and signed a covenant with the evil one. Nobody could be certain that his nearest neighbor, or most intimate friend, was not guilty of this imaginary crime. The number of those who pretended to be afflicted by witchcraft grew daily more numerous, and they bore testimony against many of the best and worthiest people. A minister, named George Burroughs, was among the accused. In the months of August and September, 1692, he, and 19 other innocent men and women, were put to death. The place of execution was a high hill, on the outskirts of Salem, so that many of the sufferers, as they stood beneath the gallows, could discern their own habitations in the town. The martyrdom of these guiltless persons seemed only to increase the madness. The afflicted now grew bolder in their accusations. Many people of rank and wealth were either thrown into prison, or compelled to flee for their lives. Among these were 2 sons of old Simon Bradstreet, the last of the Puritan governors. Mr. Willard, a pious minister of Boston, was cried out upon as a wizard, in open court. Mrs. Hale, the wife of the minister of Beverly, was likewise accused. Philip English, a rich merchant of Salem, found it necessary to take flight, leaving his property and business in confusion. But a short time afterwards, the Salem people were glad to invite him back. The boldest thing that the accusers did, continued grandfather, was to cry out against the governor's own beloved wife. Yes, the lady of Sir William Phips was accused of being a witch, and of flying through the air to attend witch meetings. When the governor heard this, he probably trembled, so that our great chair shook beneath him. "Dear grandfather," cried little Alice, clinging closer to his knee, "is it true that witches ever come in the night time to frighten little children?" "No, no, dear little Alice," replied grandfather. "Even if there were any witches, they would flee away from the presence of a pure-hearted child. But there are none, and our forefathers soon became convinced, that they had been led into a terrible delusion.